Welcome everybody as you come in. Um, we're gonna wait a bit while people come in, but we want to do introductions in the chat. So if you want to write in the chat your name and location, and if you have an organization, and then if you want to answer one of these questions, what do you think went wrong in the election? And what should progressives do next? Yeah, Greg put a question in, and that's fine too. Want to learn more about the role of class in the election? Yep, I think this is the place. Write your answers in the chat and read. Somebody says, I hope Dorian knows.
Yeah.
Yeah, you've got all the answers, right, Dorian? Um, great. Michelle says, I think Kamala's time to campaign was too short and misogyny and racism were factors. That's great. Yeah, and my sister Ann Wright is here. I think there are disaffected groups, especially in the middle of the country, who've been shut out by economic and academic policies for decades and who aren't getting good information from the media that is owned by billionaires, but open to other ideas. So those just joining us, see that on the screen, the two questions that people are answering as they introduce themselves. Yeah, Ann Ellsworth says lack of civic education and sense of non-interest in general. So what do you think went wrong in the election and what should progressives do next? I think we're getting more of the first question. We're still in that despair phase, but during this webinar, we're going to move on to the strategizing for fighting back. Oh, Suzanne Silber from Showing Up for Racial Justice is here from Ohio. So many causes: money in politics, Dems abandoning the working class, misinformation, weaponized transphobia. I am waiting for Serge to tell me what to do next. Me too. Showing Up for Racial Justice is a great organization. Bonnie says, what can progressives do? Get more active at all levels of legislative stuff. Yeah, we did not make clear enough all the good things that Biden did. Great. For those just joining us, Rachel says 40% of the population has been shut out of voting. Yeah, this is great. I figured that everybody would have been really, really thinking about that question a lot. Yeah, people reacted to decades of unaddressed economic inequality and heavy dose of racism and sexism too, says Lane. Thanks, Lane. So yeah, see if you've got thoughts on the second question too, of what should progressives be doing next. I'm hoping to see more mutual aid and community organizing and looking for training opportunities. I didn't catch who that was. All right, this is juicy. Yeah, difficult for Dems or anyone to overcome people voting based on fear, says Marianne. Zoe Nicoli, I'm sorry if I'm saying your name wrong, Zoe. Progressives need to coordinate all the excellent work that is going to happen through Surge, Working Families, Poor People's Campaign, et cetera, et cetera. So we're working the most effectively we can. And Suzanne agrees. Yeah, we need registered voters to show up instead of stay home. Oh my goodness. All right. Well, why don't we okay, Lorraine says, next up for me is actions to protect immigrants, like the new sanctuary ordinance in LA, and hyper-local community defense organizing. And that's getting a heart there. And Daniel Lorison, who has studied the vote, including has studied politics and what's on voters' minds quite a bit. Daniel, good to have you. Mostly what's wrong, we don't have a good way to connect regular people to politics, decline of unions, Scotch Falls hollowing out of civic organizations, etc. All right. So we're off and running with the topic of the webinar. If you're just arriving, there's a lot of good stuff in the chat. Welcome to the latest in the series of Talking Class webinars sponsored by the Working Class Studies Association, which holds many wonderful events. And we are really, really happy that Dorian Warren is with us today. Dorian, you may know as a political scientist, somebody who's been watching politics for a long time, and also as an activist and advocate, long history with the labor movement, with many social movements, and currently Dorian is the co-president of Community Change that works with grassroots organizations all over the US. So you are so welcome, Dorian, because you are the one who can bridge our two big questions today of what went wrong and what should our strategy be next. So we're going to do this in two halves on the two questions. My co-facilitator, Jack Metzgar, is going to ask Dorian some questions about the vote, the breakdown, the analysis of who voted how and why. And then we're going to switch gears, and I'm going to ask Dorian some questions about strategy for movement building. And we're going to keep all that contained enough that there's plenty of time for discussion. So feel free to write questions in the chat, but we're going to try to have the last 25 minutes or so be questions for Dorian and your own thoughts on these big timely questions. So take it away, Jack.
Okay. Again, Dorian, thank you for doing this for us. You're one of the few people that, as a political scientist, can talk about electoral politics and have followed it for a long time and studied it and connected in lots of different ways to various social movements. So it's really great for us to have you here. The post-election autopsies, which is what they are, from the Democratic side, they're all over the place. And they're a very daunting group of them, and lots of blame shaming and axe grinding and things like that. One of the through lines is that the Democrats have lost over time, and then now more dramatically, the working class. And we're going to get to that. But before we do, what do you think other causes of the sweeping Democratic loss that we should be paying attention to? Something happened with Dorian. Could nobody hear me?
There we go. Thank you. I couldn't unmute myself, so I couldn't. Oh, yeah, we can hear you, Jack. That's fine. So first, thank you to Betsy and Jack for inviting me to be with all of you tonight. And I'm here to learn just as much as I think you might be, because none of us have this all figured out and probably feeling overwhelmed. And I want to say hi to some very old friends, including some former students of mine who are here, who are all grown up and are faculty themselves now. So it's great to see you. Jack, to answer your question, I think the punchline is all of the above. All the reasons people are putting in the chat, they're all probably right. And let me back up and just say, for myself, I've been overwhelmed by all the noisy hot takes out there. And there's so many that it's hard to make sense of some of them. And my advice is to stay curious, to ask really difficult questions, which we're going to do in this call. And I would say be skeptical of anyone who comes out punching down or punching left out the gate, because that probably means they were waiting to do that no matter what. And so it's very frustrating to me that immediately people are just like punching down and punching left, like because and I'm going to put this in the chat. Some of you may have seen this image of incumbents around the world who have lost. So this isn't just a US phenomenon. This is a very global phenomenon of incumbent parties doing very, very poorly around the world. And I think it forces us to ask some hard questions about, frankly, was there anything any of us could have done differently, including the campaign? Or were there headwinds just so fierce that it was just, we all did the best we could and this is the outcome? Now, I don't want to believe that, because I want to believe that we all have agency. But I would say, and we're going to dive in, I know, into the data. There is a piece that I enjoyed reading. I'll also put it in the chat by Waleed Shahid, which basically categorizes 10 genres of explanations. And I think it's a very helpful, like, he's just like, all right, Dems didn't deliver tangible economic change, or Dems are too woke, or Dems ignored the border, or Dems spent too much money, or Dems didn't spend enough money, or they're elitist and not populist enough. Racism, sexism, he just like categorizes all the genres of argumentation, which I just think is a very helpful shortcut for you to, when you're reading, you can plug in whatever you're reading into one of the 10 categories, like, oh, it's this reason that this person's arguing. So that's my short answer. I'm going to put that in the chat while we move to the slides, if you want to talk us through those.
Okay, yeah. The first slide, which I believe is up, shows that the working class as a whole, defined by education, that is, people who don't have at least a bachelor's degrees are working class. And all colors, the entire working class, only 42% voted for Harris. And that, as you can see, is down from the 47% that voted for Harris, or for Biden. In the white working class, that is whites without bachelor's degrees, only 32%. Again, that's down from 36. And we'll get to that later. But so there's, and this is a long run trend that both Dorian and I and many others have been following since really 2000, the loss of the white working class. But now there's a trend of the voters of color working class seems to be the same way, and we'll get to that. But if you show income, if you put that income and union household slide up, Betsy, by income, so far as I know, the first time since World War II, under 50,000, that is, households with less than $50,000 in income, did not vote majority Democrat. That's 50,000 and the equivalent of what 50,000 was 20 years ago, et cetera. So that's a significant change. And again, you can see it's down went from Biden to Harris down. Likewise, under 100,000 voted for Trump and only 46% for Harris. Union households, again, that's down. They gave Harris a majority, but that number is typically in the 57, 59 range. And so there was a significant loss there, as there was with every other group. Forgot to mention that, and in some ways this is embarrassing, but families, households with over 100,000 voted for Harris. I think it's 52% or something like that. But the only income group that she won was over 100,000. So a lot of analysis has been about the loss of the working class, and I think that's especially interesting to us in working class studies. And I'm eager to hear what you make of that argument as really one of the centerpieces of what happened, not just in this election, but has been happening to the Democratic Party.
Well, the quick answer is do I agree that losing the working class has been a key factor here? Absolutely, yes. And I think it's been really difficult to untangle all the reasons why. So one of the big ones that I think a lot of people are walking around is how do we make sense of so-called good economic conditions or an improvement in economic conditions versus the subjective interpretations of those conditions in people's lives. To put it a different way, I have a old colleague who calls it the death of deliverism, the idea of just delivering goodies. Okay, delivering COVID vaccine, to delivering cash checks during the economic recession in the midst of the pandemic, or delivering an expanded child tax credit, or delivering on a very pro-labor National Labor Relations Board and other appointments. Partly these are DC things and people are much more attuned to local politics, but also just because you deliver some goods, and there's a lot we can talk about that wasn't delivered. Did we get labor law reform or minimum wage increase? But of the things, of the economic things delivered, there is a disconnect between doing good policy and having an organizing strategy and a narrative strategy that connects with ordinary people and working class people. And actually, so that's one. Like it just doesn't work that way because we are all in our own media bubbles and filter bubbles, for one. So the information we get, depending on where you get your information, greatly determines how you interpret what politicians are doing, how that affects your life, and then what your political outlook is. So we know that, for instance, the less voters, I just saw this data 2 days ago, I think it's from Data for Progress, the less voters paid attention to news, the more likely they were to vote for Trump. So there's like a low information voter thing happening partly. Another line of argumentation I've seen, and this is this is part of the conversation of why didn't Kamala Harris go on Joe Rogan, for instance. You could say, well, the Democrats don't go where people actually are. Like if people are really, and working class folks and working class men in particular, they're in like the bro podcast land. If you don't even engage with people where they are, then what are you actually doing? That's kind of political malpractice. Mm-hmm. You have to start where people are. It's like principle number one of any kind of organizing. So doing, hundreds of millions of dollars of ads on MSNBC or CNN when a whole bunch of people are tuned out of that doesn't make a lot of sense. That's a second argument I've seen. And then I think a third argument, by the way, Jack, Democrats lost the working class in 2020 as well. Yes. Just to be clear. And they've been losing the working class for a while. So as you pointed out, this is a long running trend. Although it will be interesting to see as we dive into the numbers, I think more in the future, if that varies by state. Mm-hmm. Because people are also attuned to their state or local level media ecosystem. So it's a question I have. I don't know the answer. Like, would it vary, say, in Illinois or Michigan or Wisconsin versus someplace else? I don't know. I don't know. But I'm curious how you would answer this question.
Oh. Good. There is one thing I want to add to that, and I think you did a very good, comprehensive job. It does seem to me that Democrats think working class people are too dumb to explain things to. And I'll give an example. In the debate, and every time I heard Harris talk about Trump's tariffs, she said this was a national sales tax, which of course it is not. But Trump says no, that China will pay it and other countries will pay it. And she just says, no, it's a national sales tax. Everybody will cost it. How much does it take to explain the causal chain that it's actually Walmart and Best Buy and that's who's going to pay the tariff. And then they're going to pass that on as a price increase. It's not that hard to explain. And there's there's other things like that, like the way they explain the child tax credit. It's all about reducing poverty. People making $100,000 will get $300 a month per child, but they don't mention that. And so I have frustration that there's a kind of a lack of explanation. And I go back, as you know, I wrote a book about the 1950s and the steelworkers. Then there's all these complicated macroeconomic explanations that people with eighth grade educations are supposed to understand, and they did to a great extent. They did.
Yes.
So that's what I'd add to your group.
Here's another. I have one more thought on this question. That's been bothering me as a Black person who grew up working class. I am no longer working class, but I was just thinking about the conversation also about who gets left out and what do we assume when we say working class. So if you take working class Black men and women in this election and compare them to everybody else, it's the exact same economic conditions. So what explains why a working class Black woman in particular would vote a certain way and why a working class, say, white woman would vote the opposite way? It's and I raise it as a curiosity because I think it starts to give us a sense of the explanation cannot be biological or genetic. Black people aren't just born that way. Black people don't come out the womb voting Democrat. So it can't be that. That's ridiculous and absurd. So then what happens, right? Is it where Black people, working class Black people make meaning? Is it at barbershops and beauty salons? And let's be real, those are racially segregated spaces mostly in America for historical reasons, yes. But there is some political talk happening in some places where Black working class people are that is producing them as a certain kind of voter that I'm very interested in, because in terms of as an organizer and in terms of interventions and wanting to organize people, like I want to know where people are and where they're making meaning and how they end up the way they do. And so part of the answer I think we'll get to is clearly the decline of unions is playing a huge role here.
Oh, yeah.
And the decline of the labor movement, because that is the place, your union is the place where you have political conversation and make meaning and construct a collective identity. And we know from lots of data how union membership shapes voters and shapes particularly white working class voters. So anyway, I just raised that as a curiosity. And I see the chat is very active. Yes, Black people understand oppression, but like, again, you're not born. Someone has to make meaning of an experience for you. And so where does that happen? Is it in churches? Is it in community organization? Is it in a union? Is it at the barbershop? Is it at the beauty salon? Where are the places where people are making sense of that experience? And to go back to where I started, it is the same economic conditions, but people are making meaning in very different ways about the exact same conditions. And that is the curiosity I have in terms of a working class strategy. What are the working class institutions that are necessary to help people make meaning and that shape how people behave politically?
Yeah. And if anything, Black people pay more for gas and groceries in the aggregate than white people do, at least in cities. Let me switch to the slide that Betsy has up. No, we're going to skip that one. No, the breakdown by race. And although I do not trust the exit polls, particularly on this number, it looks like, it says there that whites voted 41% Dem in 2020 and also in 2024, so they didn't change. I don't believe that second number, but it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 39 to 40, showing Betsy, what's happening? Okay. Showing very little change among the white vote. This is all classes, whereas big losses among voters of color of every category. For Asian in that broad category, a 10-point loss. And one of the conclusions that some people have drawn is that there is a depolarization of race and a polarization by class. What do you make of that analysis? What's
Um,
happening between race and class here, if anything?
well, I think it's complex. I will say, just as a historical fact, there's pretty much been a ceiling on the white vote for any Democrat at the top of the ticket all the way back to 1964. So for Democrats since 1964, it's been somewhere between 39% and 43% of the white vote that any Democratic presidential candidate has gotten. And it's been like a ceiling. And you might ask, well, 1964, what happened around that time? Oh, yeah, there's this thing called the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And if you remember President Johnson saying when he signed it, infamously, I've just given over, what was it, the South to
Yeah.
the Republican Party for a generation. What's important about that is not that there is some, and I want to be careful here, not that there's some inherent racism in white people. What's important is I think he understood that he gave an opportunity to his political opponents to construct a realignment. Because it wasn't a foregone conclusion in 64 or 65 that that would happen. You maybe start to see it, but then there's a huge bump, especially in 64, of white voters for Johnson. And then by 68, that's like the begin, right? That is the beginning of the realignment in a sense. Which I want to say very clearly here. I'm not convinced what we saw this election in terms of Trump attracting not just, of course, a majority of white votes, but as these numbers show, peeling away support from voters of color. I don't want to say that that is the beginning of a realignment, although it potentially can be, depending on what we do. And I think objectively speaking, frankly, Trump and the Republican Party have been thinking much more in that way, that framework of trying to create a realignment of the electorate more than Democrats, I would argue. I think Democrats have been taking a whole bunch of voters for granted. I think there has been this notion that demographics is destiny. I think that is dead now, or it should be, because nothing happens automatically without organizing. You got to organize people into something. And I do think for Trump in particular, I won't say Republicans, let me say Trump, because there is a lot of different kinds of voting down ballot of voters who voted for Trump. But look in Wisconsin, for instance, with Tammy Baldwin, right? We can point to lots of different races where voters voted for Trump, but not, say, in North Carolina is another example, did not vote for local Republicans.
Yeah.
Right. So let's make sure we're precise about that. The second thing I would say is this is concerning, and every Democrat and progressive should be looking at these numbers and asking, like, what is going on, and then what are the interventions. The part of the story that is just now becoming clear is that the electorate in this election also, instead of going rightward, also went couchward, meaning a lot of people just stayed home. People stayed home. The data is becoming clearer and clearer and clearer of millions and millions of voters who probably would have voted for the Democrat at the top of the ticket who did not vote. And we can dive into, there's probably lots of reasons for that. The last thing I do want to say is there were clearly this is the contradiction and complexity part. There are a lot of working class policy wins at the ballot. Missouri passed the minimum wage increase. They passed paid sick leave. So this is where it gets complicated, because on the issues and on the agenda, our side should be, we win when voters directly can vote on the thing. It's the candidates that clearly are the problem in some ways, because people are saying, making choices like, well, I want to go for the authoritarian who makes me feel a certain kind of way, but I also want to raise in a minimum wage. Or take another example, Well, let me pause there. Let me pause there. So I do think there has been a ceiling on the white vote since 64. I think the main reason is the decline of the labor movement. And then I think there is secondly, there is clearly a shift rightward, yes. And we should unpack why we see these numbers. And then third, I would say people are complicated and can hold contradictory things right in their heads. They could be for all sorts of working class stuff, but not for the candidate at the top of the ticket. And then last, there are a whole bunch of missing voters. There are just a whole bunch of non-voters that we have to account for in any. So make sure you're asking that question when you're reading all the analyses of like, well, there are a whole bunch of non-voters who stay on the couch.
Right. I think we have time for one more question before we move to movement politics. An argument's being made that the Democrats focus too much on social issues and identity politics. And there is this whole punching left anti-woke thing. But I think there's a serious side to that question as well. And I'm wondering what you think about that.
I'll put a couple articles that I think kind of take this on head first in the chat. I would say first and foremost, all politics is identity politics. I actually think it's just which identity politics do you favor? So this as a fun, I'd say that as like objectively as a political scientist, all politics through all of time is an identity. It's all identity politics. You're mobilizing somebody's identities, right? Unfortunately, I think for lots of liberals and progressives, we have lost the sense. We assume too much sometimes that people are purely rational voters, as opposed to say emotional voters or have other considerations. So that's first thing. Second, just factually, because I'm laughing because it's just so absurd part of the conversation. And especially the attack on Harris around trans rights. That would only make sense if the GOP had not spent over $200 million on TV ads attacking trans rights. Right. And you don't spend $200 million on something if you don't think it's going to work. That is like that is a mobilizing of identity politics. One of the pieces I'll put in the chat is basically like, oh, Trump gets to do identity politics, but nobody else can. Well, that's like kind of absurd. Like the GOP outspent Democrats 5-1 on immigration ads in key states. So that's the second point. Like you don't spend money trying to mobilize certain kinds of identities if you don't think identity politics matters, and it does. The third thing I would say is, Jack, when we started doing these kinds of analyses 20 years ago in 2004, I remember when abortion was like the thing you never said in elections. And boy, have times have changed, right? In the sense that, I mean, that's a different kind of identity politics. It is identity politics. And Democrats were so scared of it 20 years ago. I think because of the midterms post-Dobbs in 22, where all the pundits were like, red wave, red wave, red wave, and then it didn't happen. And abortion was a big part of the story. That's really important because for the first time, Democrats were like, yeah, we're going to say abortion out loud, A. B, it might be a winning thing to campaign on for obvious reasons. And then I also think because of that experience in 22 in the midterms, I actually think Democrats overestimated the mobilizing appeal in some way. Like it didn't get enough people either to switch their votes or to get off the couch. So it's like an interesting thing to walk around. But I'm just raising it because it is sort of the identity politics I remember from 20 years ago that everybody ran from. Yeah. That at least in the last two cycles, Democrats have been running toward in a very interesting way. And for obvious, like, this is about fundamental rights. So anyway, I'm putting a couple pieces in the chat that for those of you that want to read more on this question, I might point out, I think it's two white men that are like taking on this argument about identity politics. So not the usual suspects, right? So anyway, the punchline is all politics is identity politics. Like some of us would love to have a forceful working class identity and identity politics, right? That's an identity politics too. I know what you're saying. What you're really asking is like, how do we think about class and working class compared to race and gender? And again, I would just point you to look at where particularly working class Black women don't split that difference because they're kind of all of those things. And I have a very clear, thank you, Daniel, because the other Tressie McMillan Cotton piece is also very good on this as well. So thanks for putting that in the chat. Okay, I'll shut up.
Okay. Thank you. That was very thorough. And now we got to switch to Betsy asking questions about movement politics and what movement should be doing.
We're going to stop looking at the past and start looking forward. So Dorian, do you want to just start telling us a little bit about community change and the kinds of groups that you work with and how they're going to be affected by the coming Republican reign?
Thank you. Thanks for the question, Betsy. So community change is a national sort of network of organizations that organize in low-income, working-class communities around the country, particularly in communities of color. We were founded in 1968. I have to say this because of current figures in American politics. We were founded to be a living memorial to Robert F. Kennedy after his assassination in 1968. And we were founded by a lot of people out of the war on poverty under Kennedy and, of course, Johnson. We were founded by, frankly, Walter Reuther and the UAW to be the community action arm of what the UAW was up to in the 60s. And the third group of founders, so we had war on poverty founders, the UAW, and the third group of founders were from the Black Freedom Movement, from the Civil Rights Movement, Julian Bond and late John Lewis and others. So that was, and the idea was to create organization of poor people. It was to create a poor people's movement. It was an ode to Dr. King's Poor People's Campaign as well, but it was really rooted in how Bobby Kennedy had politicized the question of poverty in that 68 campaign before he was struck down. And there was really a strong belief in that poor and working class people needed organization, that if people had organization and could speak for themselves in politics and had a voice, that it would be transformative. So we've tried to stay true to that over 50 plus years. We work with about 100 grassroots groups around the country. We're kind of the bridge and connector to federal politics and federal campaigns on issues that affect people locally. I'll come back to this point. We support people on the ground campaigns in particular places where they're around. One of our big issues now is childcare, actually, and fighting for childcare, both in terms of making it affordable for low-income and working-class people, but also ensuring that teachers and providers and educators are paid what they're worth. For those that don't have the chance to join a union yet, we have organized about 50,000 childcare providers in something we call childcare change makers. It's our little secret weapon. And we have helped to create a movement around childcare, both again with parents, low-income parents, and particularly the providers, is one of our key issues. But broadly speaking, we really focus on the intersection of economic justice issues, the safety net, social safety net. Just think like cash, think welfare and TANF and child tax credit. Also think food stamps. The SNAP program is one of our key programs. And this is where I'm coming to the second part of your question, Betsy. We do a lot of organizing around Medicaid, and we have in some places done some work on low-income housing. You asked like what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And I think it's pretty simple. The rich will get richer on the backs of low-income, poor, and working-class people. That is what's going to happen. Again, there's going to be a big tax fight next year. The Trump tax cuts from 2017, which literally transferred trillions of dollars of wealth upward from poor and working class and middle class people to literally the top 1%. They expire next year, and so they have to be renewed. And so there's going to be especially the first 100 days, I think you're going to see, at least in Washington, D.C., a lot of noise and campaigning around these tax cuts, which it's always a two-step, the tax cuts thing. We now know what the play is here from the other side. It's always like, got to cut taxes, got to cut taxes, got to cut taxes. It's trickle down, trickle down, trickle down. That's how you grow the economy. There is no empirical evidence to support any of the theory. But that's always step one. And then step two is to say, well, we have to cut now vital programs because we can't afford it. So step one is cut the revenue stream, redistribute it upwards. And then step two is cut major programs. Medicaid is going to be one of the places that they target because it costs so much money. Yeah. And so I'm really worried about Medicaid and cuts to, and my nephew relies on Medicaid to this day. So I'm really worried about Medicaid. I'm worried about the food stamp program, what we call SNAP. I'm worried about other things that low income and working class people need, like childcare, like help around housing costs. So these are the things that are going to be affected, I fear, unless we try to wage a fight and fight back, in which we're going to get to, I know, in a few minutes.
Yeah. Yeah. When you, the organizations in the Community Change Network, do you picture them focusing more on the local level, state level, national, federal level? What do you, where do you predict they'll turn their energy?
Very much this local and state level, which fundamentally I believe is where attention should be anyway. Like, I think the route to federal, to influencing national politics is through the state and local level. Like, that is actually where the power is, because it's ordinary people in a particular place that influences your House of, your representative in the House of Representatives or in the Senate. So we actually need even more focus. There's too much. I'm surrounded by the political consulting class, and here in Washington, D.C., it drives me crazy as a good Chicago boy, because they are so out of touch. People in this town, I'm not like a social person because I don't want to be around these people, because they are just out of touch with ordinary people. And there's a lot of political malpractice that happens in this town because people are out of touch. They just talk to each other. All that to say, I think the fights have to be at the local and state level. That is the pathway to influence federal policy. But also, just like, I talk to my 83-year-old mother a lot. My brother is in his early 50s, is currently unemployed, relies on Medicaid. And when I talk to them about politics, and even I was trying to say, hey, do you know about this tax fight next year that's going to affect us? They care much more about the negotiations happening now around the Chicago budget that could increase property taxes. My mother cares about this as a homeowner. She's like, taxes? The mayor I voted for is trying to raise my taxes. That is like the conversation. She's not tracking what's happening with the Trump tax cuts. So all that to say, I do think like starting there, because then I could have a conversation with them about, okay, yes, I know there's a lot happening locally. I could have a conversation with my brother about Medicaid and how the tax fight federally is connected to his own healthcare and his kids' healthcare. So I do think we have to be better. I'm a big proponent of organizing locally in the place where you are. I'm a little dubious about sort of national digital organizing and like even like the stuff that we do. We organize people again we organize childcare providers and educators, but we have them meet up locally, right? They might come to us through a digital ad or collectivism of some kind, but then it's really important to go offline and to have people take an interest in their place, because geography in my view, is where the power is.
Okay, great. So there's a strategy question I've been thinking about since right after the election. I've heard so many people just be so furious at the Trump voters and ready to just write them off and just say, wage wage a war. But then I went on the Showing Up for Racial Justice mass meeting on day two, and uh, their line, which I heard from a couple of their leaders, we're not going to blame the voters. We're not going to blame the Trump voters. And, for them organizing white people, we're not going to blame working class white people. We're not going to blame the people of color who voted for Trump. And it got me thinking about a long-standing strategy question that every social movement has had to think about, which is like, if you line everybody up by their support or opposition to your cause,
Mm.
where on the spectrum do you put your focus? Do you try to turn your passive allies into active allies and just try to talk to the people who agree with you and get them more active? Obviously, you ignore your active opposition or just treat them as the target or the opponent. But the passive opposition, the people who maybe voted for Trump, but not out of any huge ideological conviction, and the neutral people and the people who stayed home. We have limited energy, and
Yeah.
what I just wanted to get your take on where, like, Serge is going to go out there and talk to white working class and other Trump voters. What's your take on where we should be focusing?
Um, all those places that have arrows. So 4 of the 5. I mean, I think it's like, I honestly do think it's like all of the above. There will always be, and this is like what any good union organizer knows, which a lot of progressive activists have a hard time coming to grips with. But in a union campaign, you don't get to choose who you're organizing. And if
Right.
someone says, I'm voting for the boss, you got to keep going back and having hard conversations to try to move them either from active opposition to passive opposition or from passive opposition to new, right? So that is
Right.
always the task of a union organizer when the boss has usually his campaign. You can't pick and choose your voters, right, in terms of who's going to vote for the union. And I think that is the mindset we have to have. So it's partly depends, Betsy, what is your own appetite? Some
Mm,
people love talking to, say, those in the passive opposition
right.
category. And if that is your thing, please go do more of that. That is fantastic. Go do it. We need you. If you think you have appetite and energy to talk to passive allies and try to move them into active allies, go do that. That's great. Just do something. It's like the punchline. Doesn't matter what you do, just do something.
But
Let me add to here. So I think we kind of need it all, but here's the key. I think we need this term trusted messengers.
yeah.
To be able to persuade somebody and move them to a different place, you have to be authentic and you have to be trustworthy. And part of the broader, I think, context in which we live in is one, just a low trust in institutions generally. People do not trust institutions. They see them all as corrupt and elitist, whether it's government, whether it's journalism, whether it's groups like mine or a union. So there is like I'm kind of living through kind of a legitimacy crisis in terms of institutions. And I think those kind of legitimacy crises of institutions always favor the right by default. So we're at a structural disadvantage. I think that then means we, as progressives, generally have to do a lot more listening to where people are. So that's related to the second point I want to make here. People talk a lot about messaging and communications and narrative. And I actually believe now, and you all should push back, I believe what I would call narrative infrastructure is more important than the narrative content or the message itself. We get so hung up on the magic words that are going to convince somebody. And I'm very skeptical of the magic words theory. If you just say these words, be more populist, be more this, be more that, I kind of think that's not as important at actually finding and reaching people where they actually are. Because that's actually what the right has actually found people where they are. They flooded the zone with misinformation. And then, this is sort of the Joe Rogan kind of conversation. It's like his podcast is not about politics generally. It's about a whole range of stuff. It is like a 3 hour thing. And then politics comes in. But because it is about a range, right? He is someone who is attracting an audience, because I think his audience sees him as authentic and a real person who doesn't talk down, right, to his audience. But my point here is an infrastructure point. Like, can we figure out where people are? Can we build a different kind of infrastructure that people might want to come to? And then can we invest in authentic and trusted messengers? Which I think is more important than just the magic words, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
Um,
it does.
so that's my quick thing. I could say a lot more about narrative and communications, but yeah, I think we get caught up in like the right, and it's a whole industry, by the way. Like you can walk down the street in Washington, D.C. and like bump into 5 pollsters on a block. They make a lot of money telling people what to say. They walk around with their little thermometer, right, to tell people what to say. I am much more interested in like how to be a thermostat to move people to a different place. But you got to go to where people are for that, or you got to build something that people want to come to.
Yeah, and I'm going to go back to the last slide and also read what Suzanne Silber, who's active in Surge, said in the chat. Surge completed care calls and went on the ground in Asheville after it was flooded, which was appreciated by people there. And
Yeah.
I think that's what they're really working at is getting messengers to white conservatives and white working class apolitical people who are from the communities who people can relate to.
Can I add one other thing? I've been thinking,
Yeah,
I want to combine Jack's, the data from the exit polls, the flawed data from the exit polls, and this point on narrative infrastructure. So what was it? 53% of union households voted for the Democrat, if I'm right? Yeah, 53%. Okay. And I think something like, again, this is take it with a grain of salt, something like union households maybe made up 19% of the electorate, something around there. Let's say it's 20%, just for argument's sake. So that's about a fifth of the electorate that are in union households. We know that if you're in a union household, you're much more likely to vote Democrat. Okay, what we didn't look at was the white evangelical vote. And they also make up about 20% of the electorate. And why? And they vote like black people vote for Democrats. It's like 85% white evangelical vote for Trump. Why is that important from a narrative perspective? Because talk about narrative infrastructure. Every Sunday, there is storytelling and meaning making happening. And whether small, big, or mega churches, that is narrative infrastructure. And then the content, right? The messaging, it's not like talking points from a Democratic pollster. They are deep, recognizable stories that people understand. If I say the story David and Goliath to you, you're going to know exactly what I mean, even if you're not a Christian or religious, because that's a deep story that is relatable. So there is meaning making and narrative work happening every freaking Sunday in an evangelical church. If you want to understand why Latinos are going more to the right, that's a place to look. And so if the labor movement, which I come out of, thank you, Jack, if the labor movement is like our biggest on the left, right, and for working class people, if that's the biggest alternative to the power of evangelical churches, tell me what union talks to their members every Sunday. Or tell me what union today offers classes and Bible study and mutual aid during the week for their members and does political education. So there is a mismatch in my head. There's sort of an asymmetry here. Like we do our best, right? Like unions, they do their best. But when you take a step back and just think about the infrastructure, again, I keep coming back to this word of infrastructure. And by that, I mean organizing infrastructure, narrative infrastructure, because that is the place I feel like we all have some agency and can intervene. Boy, we have to really think really clearly and hard about the power and the role of evangelical churches and what they do to organize people, to make meaning for people, and to frankly mobilize people to vote.
Great. That makes a lot of sense. Discouraging. I wonder if I should skip a question because we want to save time for discussion.
If people can see this slide, Betsy, what I can say to you is all of the above.
Okay. Okay.
It's
Yeah.
all well, mostly all of the above. Like the lawsuit thing, we're going to leave that to the movement lawyers. There's the ACLU and all the legal defense funds. But everything else you have here is going to be important in some way. We're going to need all of these things on the table because I want to make sure we don't walk away from this call assuming that this was just another normal election.
No.
And that we're in normal political times and we just got to wait it out till 26. If you have been reading any news of the last week, you already know that this is something very different than any of us have experienced in our lifetimes. If you lived through January 6th, you also know this is something very different. We are heading back to a kind of authoritarianism that sits uncomfortably with so-called democracy. And it's not like it's a secret. That whole Project 2025 thing, it's kind of really laid out pretty clearly. They're like, here you go. You want to know what we're going to do? Does anyone want to read 900 pages? No. But it's there. It's there.
Can I say the Wikipedia entry on it is very readable and short. So I encourage
you
to go to Wikipedia, look up Project 2025 and read the provisions, and it's terrifying. It's completely, shredded.
So I only raise that, Betsy, and then I'll shut up to say there are a couple things here: nonviolent direct action and civil disobedience, strikes and or boycotts. There are going to be things we have to do in this next period that involve non-cooperation and non-compliance. That's more than just getting out to vote or going to a protest, but actually non-compliance, refusal to comply, disruption in a real way, not a performative disruption, but actually stopping things from happening. We're going to have, I think as a movement, collectively, all of us are going to have to take our game to a different level because that is what the moment calls for if we want to put a stop to some really evil and harmful things that are on the horizon.
Great. So I got mostly I've been feeling very despairing, as I'm sure we all have been, but I got this little burst of not exactly hope, but energy reading this article in Waging Nonviolence by Mark and Paul Engler. A new wave of movements against Trump is coming. And the article goes back to what happened during the first Trump administration. And, we lost a lot of battles. We stopped him from doing some things, but not a lot of things. But they make the case that the opposition to the policy proposals in the first Trump term had really great movement building impact during and after. That the mobilizations turned into substantive things like the Women's March segueing into the Me Too movement and all the state reproductive rights stuff and Black Lives Matter and the youth doing mass climate mobilization, like the Sunrise Movement. So I wondered if you share their sense that that was the seed of all that great movement building, that it grew out of pushing back against Trump. And then do you have any hope that will happen again?
Yes and yes.
Okay.
Yes and yes. I will just simply say, don't assume defeat before we start to fight. Good. It's actually a lesson learned. I took this job. I started this job in the end of 2016 on the assumption that I was going to be like the poor people, working class lobbyists with the Clinton administration. That was like the context in which I signed the contract for the job. Um, and then all of a sudden, after the 16 election, like we had to immediately stand up what we called the safety net defense campaign to really protect repeal of the ACA. We were very concerned about Medicaid, and we were concerned that the SNAP program, food stamps, would be destroyed. And a lot of people in this town assumed that we were going to lose both in January of 2017. That was the starting assumption. And when I would talk to grassroots organizers and leaders, they're like, hell no, let's go organize and fight back. And we actually won. And I think reminding people that you can actually win under really tough conditions is really important as a motivating, just right? Because like people generally want to sign up and raise their hands on something that feels good and like probably will win. Like who wants to go to a boring ass party that is always losing? Like not me. Like I want to invite something and people into something that is exciting and fun and can win. The second lesson I think we learned from that period, and I love this piece, and I hope you'll share. There's a link in the chat that people can read it. Don't assume that the Trump or the MAGA coalition is a monolith.
No.
There is a lot of opportunity to go on offense and frankly wedge the other side like they wedge us and divide us all the time. So I remember from the 2017 fight around food stamps, the SNAP program, part of some people in our coalition had a back channel to Walmart, which is like when I was coming up as a baby organizer, that was the enemy, as Jack remembers in Chicago. You don't talk to Walmart, that is the enemy. And what our coalition understood was that 13% of their revenue comes from the SNAP program. So Walmart had a self-interest in making sure the SNAP program didn't get cut. And that then led to Walmart putting pressure on their home state senators. Now, did it change votes? Not really, but it at least made it uncomfortable. Right? It at least neutralized maybe what would have been some more vocal opposition, support for cutting the program. So thinking like that, not assuming that like the right wing, whatever we might say, is a monolith. Like when it comes to Medicaid, there are a lot of rural hospitals that rely on Medicaid funding to exist. That is an organizing opportunity.
That's right.
Boy, talk about an on-ramp for some rural organizing across race in this moment. That would be amazing. So anyway, I just want to, that's sort of some lessons learned from that period of not assuming defeat before we even start to fight. And these are going to be some very hard fights and they will be different, but let's not assume defeat before we start.
Awesome.
And let's be a bit more sophisticated because under some conditions we could actually win.
All right. I think that's a good stopping place for opening it up for discussion. That's an inspiring thing to think about. So if you can put in the chat questions for Dorian, but also your own answers to these two questions. And maybe we can allow people to unmute themselves. What do you imagine is going to work best to thwart the MAGA agenda in the coming years? And also, where do you as an individual or as a group member imagine putting your social justice energy? So I think I'm looking to see if I can allow people to unmute themselves. Yeah, let's see if I'm allowing you to unmute yourself. So either put a question or a comment and answer to one of those questions in the chat, or unmute yourself and we'll see if we can have some discussion without all talking at once. So who's got a question or comment? Yeah.
Well, Jack, you came off mute. I think you wanted to jump back in.
And no, I had some other things, but electoral politics. I think the movement stuff is what's encouraging right now, and particularly what you said about Medicaid And Medicaid and food stamps is what I'm reading are major places that they'll go after.
Yeah.
Not ACA so much.
Well,
Yeah.
also remember about education, that the Project 2025, they're saying abolish the Department of Education, but it specifically calls out school lunches and federal aid to K-12 schools. So I think as part of the push against education and DEI in education and so forth, I think that will be frontline also, besides healthcare and union rights. So yeah.
If there are no other questions,
I
we're
have
going to
one.
ask you. I'm sorry.
I've got one. This is Allison. I'm trying to raise
Yeah.
my hand. Dorian, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to hear you speak. And I have to say, I've been one of the people that have hidden after the election. I kind of like held my breath and needed a pause to sort of see. But the question, this is not the most important question at all, but one of the frustrating things I think for many of us is that we have not even been able to convince some of our families, especially working class families.
Yeah.
And I have, it's my mother would constantly call me during the whole election season, asking me as a sociologist, what is going on? And I'm like, you have two sisters who are voting for Trump. Convince them, stand up to them. And it's just hitting a wall over and over again with people that you even love and know, and you still can't have a handle on what to do. So I don't know if you have any advice for that. And like I said, it's not the most important question, but that is something that has been sort of very emotionally fraught for many of us.
Yes, I don't have any good advice. I'm curious if others do. Please, let's crowdsource this answer because it's really hard. And I do think it's important. The relationships of trust are important, and I think that requires for a lot of us much more listening than talking, and much more real listening and asking questions. And kind of, there is like a whole field of popular education, right, that relies on people's, and you probably know this already, you're like trying to draw from people's experiences and get them to a different kind of understanding of maybe how they even interpret their own experience. I just say that to say there's going to be so many opportunities to raise questions with your family members or friends in this next period. Okay, so Trump is for working class people. What do you think is going on around these tax cuts? Let's just have a conversation about it. And it's going to keep coming up and coming up and coming up and coming up. Well, what do you think that means for someone in your family on Medicaid or someone, you know what I mean? Betsy, you mentioned all the cuts to key programs in schools that the Department of Education funds.
Yeah.
Boy, that seems like a moment ripe for parent organizing. So maybe also, Allison, the answer is you're allowed to give yourself grace and take a break from trying to organize your family and maybe try some other folks out. I'm eager to talk to the parents at my kids' school about this stuff and just see where they are and ask them questions. And so anyway, I think there's lots of different approaches here, but also maybe the advice I would say is give yourself grace. It's not all on your shoulders to convince everybody in your family to do something different. So yeah, I'm curious what others would say to that too. There's a lot of good stuff in the chat too. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Anyone else want to, were you going to say something, Jack, or does anyone else want to
Well,
unmute?
if there's not another question, I'd like to ask Dorian, can the labor movement survive this next 4 years? Will it's been on an upward trajectory over the last decade in a way.
Yeah.
And can they continue that? What's your thinking about the labor movement?
Totally. This is being recorded, right? I'm going to get in trouble.
Yes, it is.
Oh, thanks. Okay.
Yes, we're going to share the recording with everyone who registered.
I'm curious what other people think about this too. So I have two thoughts about this, Jack. One is a positive, like affirming thing, and one is a critique. The positive affirming thing is, I think you, I think the trend is the trend, and I don't think we're going to put the genie back in the bottle. In terms of the trend, by that I mean the huge upswing in Americans who support unions. It's like we're not where we were 20 years ago.
Mhm.
More than a majority of Americans approve of labor unions. And that's a majority of people that have never experienced one, actually. So something has happened. I think there is sort of, let's call it a class consciousness that has happened. And especially if you think of, put a barista in your head. We do have this problem, some would argue, there's some sociologists in this call, where we've done elite overproduction. So we've told all these folks, a whole generation, a couple generations, people go to college and everything will work out, and then people have gone to college and everything has not worked out. And so you have a lot of angry people who are highly educated, by the way, but very like middle class people, by that I mean education wise, with no mobility options, get really mad really fast. And I think that's some of what we've seen in some kinds of organizing in the last while. That's not going away.
Yeah.
And there's no place for people to go because of the economy we've created. That is, you could argue it's kind of a caste system. There's like ceilings on all sorts of stuff, right? And so people are like, what the hell? You told me to do this stuff. I have all this debt that's not going away, which, by the way, assume the debt will, right, student debt in particular, for a group of folks that can be organized and mobilized. President-elect is basically like, the hell with all that debt cancellation stuff, pay your debt, even though he got to unleash all his stuff from Trump University. Anyway, I digress. So I think there is something generational. There's a generational shift, and I don't think that's going to change in terms of unions. I think that's good. I also think there's going to be, a lot of harm and pain and hurts, especially in whatever the next regime does around mass deportations. And I've been thinking about this a lot because immigrant rights is one of the things I do work on. And I've just been really thinking, like, which unions can get together right now and be ready to go in terms of meatpacking, poultry, agriculture? Because if mass deportations start in those immigrant heavy industries, you might add hospitality to that too. Boy, how's that going to work out? Because if they do make good and target and deport a whole lot of workers, then that's going to immediately jack up prices because we're going to have a labor shortage. Because we know that we rely on immigrant workers, right, for our food. That's just a basic matter. So who is going to do that work? How are those industries and employers going to respond, by the way? Like, that's a question I have. Like, are they going to just sit and take it? Or are they going to say, wait, we don't want to be part of this. We didn't sign up for this part of the coalition. We just thought he was saying that stuff. We didn't know he was going to do it, right? So there's like a lot of organizing interventions that we're going to have to try and do. And I do think I think at this moment and this next period will be ripe for organizing. But here's then the critique. Again, for how many decades have we been having this argument in the labor movement about money towards new organizing? Is it 20 years ago next year? The AFL-CIO broke apart, right? Yes.
Yeah.
So like, the Teamsters and the UAW and SEIU and the there are a lot of unions where like the question is called now, given they're not going to have a labor-friendly board. Like, what are you going to do? Where are you going to invest? In terms of new organizers, we also have a talent problem. I think Daisy Ricks is on the call, and her work like 20 years ago identified this talent problem, but like we have a talent problem of good, talented union organizers, either from the shop floor or college kids, either one, Like I am looking for very good, talented organizers in this moment that know how to not only organize across race and gender and with people who don't already agree with you, but also are ready to organize against corporations. Like I'm looking for strategic corporate organizers like that and campaigners that are like want to lean into those fights. But the labor movement could invest in a very big and new way in this moment. I've been thinking a lot about, for some of the historians here, I think Lane is on the call or was, like, I've been thinking a lot about Operation Dixie, which is the effort in 1946 of the CIO to organize the South, period. I think they hired like 2,000 organizers or something to organize the South, which then resulted, frankly, in Taft-Hartley. And right, the steelworkers is something to do with that too, Jack.
Yeah.
But there was a moment where there was a vision of like, yo, we're going to organize workers at scale in the hardest places. And I think that's the moment we're in right now. Like, can we imagine that? And which unions want to sign up to do that? The promise, I'll say, last thing, this is promising, led by the UAW. The UAW and President Fain is in conversations with SEIU and Unite Here and a few teachers unions as well about lining up everybody's contracts to expire in 2028. What? So like basically a general strike.
Whoa.
That is the kind of thinking that's required in this moment.
Whoa.
If they can pull it off. Now, Unite Here, when I used to work there, like, it was in and around that union 20 years ago, there was some of that. I think in 08 and 12, they lined up a few of their contracts with hotels and cities. So this is not like a foreign practice, so to speak. Like there is some muscle memory potentially. But like that's the exciting part. Can we imagine the UAW and SEIU and the AFT and NEA and like lots of others lining up their contracts all to expire around the same time in 2028? That would create a transformative moment of power and bargaining, like bargaining over the whole democracy,
Right.
not just over the workplace, but the democracy. That could be really exciting. And so as all of you have conversations in your communities and with some locals, start asking about it. Like, hey, I heard this thing about a general strike in 2028. Like, how do I sign up for that? Like, help me. So anyway, that's the hopeful note maybe here.
Yeah, good.
That's awesome. We're getting a lot of good comments in the chat, and the only one that I see is like a question is Allison asking, is there an age breakdown of how people voted? Do you all have the same data you have on class and race and gender on age?
I do not.
Okay.
It's there, it's available, but I just didn't copy it out.
All right, let's see if, let me ask again, these forward-looking questions. What do you think is going to work? We're getting great ideas from Dorian, but what do you imagine will be effective in forwarding MAGA agenda? And where do you picture? We've got a couple people in the chat saying where they're going to put their energy. That Sarah, you're saying working on the healthcare in rural areas to save Medicaid. Anyone else want to unmute or write in the chat? What do you think is going to work, and where do you picture putting your own energy? Or do we not yet have any energy? Are we still in the?
Well, I'll jump in and say, I don't know. I don't know what's going to work. I don't think most people know what's going to work. And that then leads me to say, well, then we have to be very experimental in this period with the things in our toolbox to try some things and see what works. I have a couple ideas. Will they work? I don't know, but
you want to see your ideas?
Well, I mean, we can't play by, to go back to David and Goliath, we can't play by Goliath's rules, right? So we are all the Davids in a sense. And so powerless people have always, for thousands of years, right? There's like the same playbook from the Goliaths, and then there's kind of a similar playbook for David's. And it's kind of two things. I think it's like organizing and really great strategy. And that's kind of it for me. And on the strategy part, like I'm much more interested in trying, like I don't want to be distracted by Trump. And I don't actually want to target Trump. Now, some people in the movement will do that and they'll have conversations with friends and family and talk about Trump. I am much more interested with going after the enablers of Trump. That's in union parlance, that would be like secondary targets. I'm much more interested in the secondary targets that are the enablers of the thing, because that's where I think I can imagine getting leverage and actually beating up on some folks to get them to either be neutral or defect. And so that's that as a strategic intervention, that's more interesting to me than the focus on the guy. Now, Trump makes a good villain for some people, but as we just learned, a whole bunch of people like that dude. So like pick which strategic intervention works for you. But I'm much more interested in like in the enablers. And because I'm seeing the chat, like in a time of mass roundup and deportation, like trying to influence Trump or Stephen Miller is not going to work. But like going after some employers who rely, frankly, on undocumented workers, now like let's see what are they going to do? What are they going to do? And can we call the question for them? Right, to say, well, then you need to call the White House, or you need to do what you need to do with the Chamber of Commerce or whoever it is. So anyway, I'm much more interested in thinking about the enablers and secondary targets as one of several strategies we got to put on the table. But I don't think any of us know what's going to work in this moment.
Others? Reactions? We're getting some good things in the chat. Greg is saying advocate for better jobs. That's how Trump won, because that's what people want. He promises a manufacturing superpower. We promise $15 an hour. We got 2 hearts on that one. Yeah.
And also, I've been thinking a lot, and I'm the older I get, the more I read about the Reconstruction period in American history. And I've just been thinking a lot about, I don't have a good sense of what the abolitionist movement strategy was, honestly. But talk about people with much less resources and power than all of us have right now in this moment. They figured out a strategy to win. Now, yes, it partly led to a civil war and it took a war, but there are other, I don't know, suffragette. We should like draw a little bit on our history of our people that preceded us with much less in terms of resources and freedoms, actually. True. They were able as underdogs to figure out how to organize and topple the Goliaths. And I do think we can't, we have to draw from our own movement histories a bit more in this period for guidance, not to replicate the thing, because they were living under different conditions for sure than what we are living through and about to live through. But yes, Miranda, our ancestors survived worse, but with much less stuff. So it's on us to figure this out. And it also means to try stuff. By the way, Laura, I see your point about HR 9495. For people that don't know, that is basically the national bill to acorn all of us, to basically just wipe out
pass the House
progressive today. It passed the House. It won't pass the Senate. It'll be blocked in the Senate, but then it'll come back come January 20th. So it's going to happen. A lot of us are having conversations about how to protect organizations and what to do, which we don't know yet. Right now, we're just focused on blocking it in the Senate, but they are coming for us. The right is so good at coming for infrastructure, organizational infrastructure on the left. We've seen it with the labor movement time and time again. Now they're coming for the rest of us. They're like, yo, we're going to come for the labor movement, but we're coming for all this other stuff too.
Yeah.
I do think our movement has to have a conversation. I'm in lots of conversations with people about building power, building power, building power. I'm also more interested in this moment about what dismantling and I can't think of a better word, destroying of the right's power we should be thinking about as well. It's not just enough to build power. There's some dismantling and deconstruction of infrastructure on the right that we should also be thinking about. Or I wish someone in our movement was thinking about that. Like, who's taking on the Heritage Foundation, who created Project 2025? Who's taking on Fox News? We know how they influence millions of voters in this cycle. Who's taking on these key institutions of the right and their enablers that disempowers them or depowers them or dismantles some of their infrastructure? Like, we need more people thinking about that.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, enough with the building power. I know we all got to build power. Yeah, exactly. Who's taking on Alec? There was a campaign 10 years ago by Color of Change, but then like after they finished that campaign, no one else did. Like, there's this, we don't think in the structural way, in a way that the right does. They're like, okay, we're going to take power. We're just going to destroy your institutions. And then all we do is say, well, maybe we want to replicate your institutions. And I'm not sure that's what's called for in this moment.
We're getting to the end of our time. That was a great inspiring place to stop. I mean, I'll stay on afterwards if anybody wants to stay, but to respect the people who want to leave on time, I just want to announce the next couple working class studies events. And say that on December 13th, there's a Writing Our Working Class Stories, talk, but workshop with Denise Wagner. And then the next in this series of Talking Class webinars, we've got Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove, who co-authored the book, very, very good book, White Poverty, with Reverend William Barber. So we'll make sure everyone who registered for this event gets the announcements of those events. And in case people want to step off, let me say just a huge thank you to you, Dorian. The dates should be showing on the screen, Greg. January 23rd is the one with Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove.
And after that, we'll have Allison Hurst on March 13th.
All right.
Yeah, we're doing it every other month. And yeah, Allison Hurst will be our following guest. So, but let's just do like a round of chat, applause, and thank you to Dorian.
Yeah.
Thank you, Betsy and Jack. Thanks to all of you for the conversation in the chat as well. I've been tracking and learning a lot. So really. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, let me just say that Dorian and I go back a ways when he was still a graduate student, actually. But I'm impressed not only with all the things that you know and you're thinking, but there's a wisdom that has come upon you as you've gotten older. And I think that really shines through today. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's called having the best mentors and teachers. So thank you, Jack, really. And thanks again to this community that I was so privileged and fortunate to be a part of at the very beginning, a long time ago. And this has been very nourishing for my spirit and soul. So thank you.
Oh, many thanks, Dorian and Jack, for your questions and everybody who put so many good points in the chat. Pleasure to be with you all, and let's hang together over this terrible, challenging coming time. Let's stick with each other and try to make some real stuff happen.
Okay. Great.
Good night, everybody.
Night, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.